Thank you for that very warm and generous introduction. I'm really pleased to join you here and very honoured to be delivering this lecture, this equality lecture, at Merton College. Tonight I want to discuss equality. In particular, to pose the question, equality or liberation? Or perhaps more accurately, to propose the thesis, equality versus liberation, with specific reference to the struggle for LGBT human rights. Now, my starting point is, apart from homophobes, transphobes and biphobes, who could possibly disagree with equality? I can. It's not because I'm against equality, it's that I don't think it's sufficient. I think it's a laudable aim, it's in the right direction, but of itself, equal rights is not sufficient to secure the liberation of LGBT people, or women, or black and ethnic minority people, or the disabled, or anyone else. Equality is not enough. Now, in terms of the LGBT community, I don't feel comfortable with the way in which it has historically, over the last 2 decades, gradually, slowly, surely, dumbed down its aspirations to the limited goal of equal rights. My question is, whatever happened to the lofty ideals of queer liberation and sexual freedom? Where did they disappear to? Now, this dramatic shift in the LGBT zeitgeist started in the 1990s and coincided with a move into the political mainstream. It seems that greater acceptance by the straight establishment precipitated greater compromise by the LGBT community. We moved away from defining our needs on our terms and instead began meekly falling in with the prevailing heterosexual consensus. In fact, we've now reached a situation where the dominant LGBT agenda is equal rights and law reform, rather than queer emancipation and social transformation. To me, that is a political retreat, and it represents a massive loss of imagination, confidence, and vision. I want to emphasize that equality is important. My point is, it's not sufficient. It's got its limitations. It isn't the panacea that many claim. So, for example, equality for LGBT people inevitably means parity on straight terms, within a pre-existing framework of values, laws, and institutions. These haven't been devised by LGBT people, they've been devised by and for the heterosexual majority, stretching back not decades but centuries. If we look to mere equality, if we seek mere equality, it involves our conformity to their rules. We fit in with their system. We conform to what is. We simply want equality within it. And I see that as a formula for submission and incorporation, not liberation. Now, I want to emphasize that getting rid of homophobic, biphobic and transphobic discrimination is a very laudable aim. And I've been very much part of that campaign myself. But it simply does not go far enough. Ending anti-LGBT bias will not resolve all the problems faced by queer people. Some of our difficulties arise not from anti-LGBT prejudice, or at least not from that alone, but from a more general erotophobic and sex-negative nature of contemporary culture. And that also harms heterosexual people. These destructive puritanical attitudes, less pronounced than they were a decade or two or three or four ago, but these destructive, negative puritanical attitudes are evident in the witch hunting of consensual underage sex, the censorship of sexual imagery, the inadequacies and failings of sex and relationship education in schools, and the criminalization of sex workers and consenting sadomasochistic relationships. Those instances highlight that the problem goes way beyond anti-LGBT prejudice. The drawbacks associated with seeking mere equality are, of course, not limited to LGBT people. They also apply to women who are forced to compete on male terms to get ahead in the workplace, and to black people who tend to only succeed if they adopt white middle-class values and assimilate into the dominant European culture. As women have discovered to their cost, and as black Britons have discovered to their cost, the equal rights agenda is often not about respecting difference, but obliterating us. They get on if they conform, if they fit in, if they assimilate. My question is, where is the dignity in that? How can we have self-respect as LGBT people if we sacrifice our queer identity and culture for the sake of parity? Sure, it is acceptance, but I would say it's not a price worth paying. Moreover, equal rights do not equate with genuine freedom. Despite formal legal equality between the sexes for decades, women's earnings are still only 4/5 of men. There are glass ceilings in so many professions where women are underrepresented, despite the laws that supposedly protect women against discrimination and guarantee equal treatment. More than half a century after the end of racially discriminatory statutes in the United States, the segregation of black and white communities, informal and voluntary in many communities, is as great as it was prior to the civil rights movement. A whole vast black underclass is still locked out of economic prosperity, despite the fact that in formal legal terms, black and white Americans have equal rights. So those to me are lessons that we queers ignore at our peril. The same fate awaits us if we simply jump on the equality bandwagon. We will end up with equal rights, but within a fundamentally unjust society where the rules are skewed against sexual choice and self-determination. I think it's obvious that equality for LGBT people is a political deal that leads to social assimilation. As a condition of equal treatment, we LGBTs are expected to conform to the straight system, adopting its norms and aspirations. The end result, LGBT co-option and invisibilization. Sure, we get equality, but the price we pay is the surrender of our own unique, distinctive queer identity, lifestyle, and values. The very important insights and ethics that we as a community have forged in response to exclusion and discrimination by a hostile straight world. The unwritten contract at the heart of LGBT law reform is that queers will behave respectably, that we will comply with the heterosexual moral agenda. No more cruising, orgies, or sadomasochism, and in return, the good gays are rewarded with equal treatment. Meanwhile, all the sex-repressive social structures, institutions, and moralities remain intact, and the bad gays remain sexual outlaws. The problem is this. The nouveau gay reformism, as I like to call it, involves the abandonment of any critical perspective on straight culture. In place of a healthy skepticism towards the heterosexual consensus, it substitutes a naive acquiescence. Discernment is abandoned in favour of compliance. We trade our souls for the gift of equal rights. I don't think this is an exaggeration. The truth is that the advocates of LGBT equality very rarely question the status quo. They are straight minds trapped in queer bodies. Accepting society as it is, these hetero-homos want nothing more than their cosy place in the straight sun. Too many are willing to mimic heterosexual norms. No attempt is made to distinguish between those elements of straight culture that are worthy of queer emulation and those that are not. If you look around, there's loads of evidence of the desire of many, not all, but many LGBT people to mindlessly appropriate every legal right that heterosexuals have, no matter how crass and morally dubious. In this country and all over the world, LGBT pressure groups have, for example, demanded the right to serve in the armed forces. But which of them have ever questioned the authoritarian nature of the military or its bloody history of human rights abuses? While homophobic discrimination within the armed forces is undoubtedly wrong and certainly worthy of challenge, so too is militarism and imperialism. In the United States, the gay rights group, the Campaign for Military Service, preached a gung-ho, God-fearing patriotism, which exonerated American excesses in places like Vietnam, Panama, Grenada, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The British Armed Forces are no better. After the Second World War, they were used to suppress national liberation struggles in Malaya, Kenya, Aden, Cyprus, and Ireland. Let's not forget that in Ireland, in the north of Ireland, under British rule, hundreds of innocent civilians were shot by the British Army in peaceful protests. Now my question is that what we queers want? To abuse and kill? Do we want to be part of a system that exemplifies historical straight machismo, a harsh, brutal form of masculinity, which has done so many bad things? I, for myself, would not want to be part of or support in any way a military system that has been involved in such human rights abuses. And that is why, during the struggle to overturn the ban on LGBT people serving in the armed forces, the group that I was involved in, Outrage, also presented a critique of the armed forces, a critique of its sexism, its racism, the class privilege of the officer class, as well as the human rights abuses. But we were almost a lone voice. Others just simply accepted, we want equality.
We want in, without questioning what that would involve. To take another issue, on the age of consent, much of the LGBT community has similarly taken leave of its ethical senses. After a campaign lasting 33 years, the age of consent in England and Wales was finally equalised at 16 in the year 2000. That was great. That was an undoubted advance. That was progress. But what about all the young LGBT people under 16? Loads of them are coming out at the ages of 11, 12, 13 and 14. According to the law, they are all criminals. And so are their straight counterparts. For me, this is not just an LGBT issue. This is an issue of the sexual human rights of young people to make their own choices. Now, of course, they need protection against sexual abuse. But isn't it shocking that in 2003, not in 1893, in 2003, the British government legislated the Sexual Offences Act, which very laudably finally abolished discrimination against gay and bisexual men in sexual offences law, but at the same time, for the first time in British history, explicitly criminalised consenting sexual contact between two young people of similar ages under the age of consent. So under that law, two 15-year-olds who have any kind of sexual contact, not sexual intercourse, or not just sexual intercourse, but kissing, touching, caressing, they are designated as serious sex criminals who face a maximum sentence of 5 years custody and placement on the sex offenders register on a par with paedophiles and rapists. That to me is profoundly shocking. That is an abuse of young people's human rights. Yet the LGBT community, for the most part, went along with that. They didn't dissent, they didn't demur, and they didn't build alliances with straight young people to challenge that kind of criminalisation. If we look at the age of consent, I'm not saying what it should be. I obviously agree that we need to protect young people against abuse by those older. I have proposed that perhaps the age of consent should stay at 16, but there should be a qualification, as they have in Switzerland, Germany, and Israel, whereby consenting sex between two young people under the age of 16 is not prosecuted, providing there's only 2 or 3 years difference in their ages. So sex between a 16-year-old and a 15-year-old would be okay, between a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old would be okay, but not between a 14-year-old and a 25-year-old. So that would give the legal protection, while at the same time ending the criminalisation of most of those young people. But again, I never heard this. I never heard it from the LGBT community, apart from outrage. I never heard it from the mainstream organisations. I know from my own private contacts that most of the sex education and child welfare groups support this proposal. But they saw the way I was demonised and pilloried when I made these proposals. So even though they agree with what I was saying about this banded 2-year or 3-year difference, they won't say so publicly because they fear in this frantic, hysterical climate that they'll be wrongly accused of condoning child sex abuse. Another issue is, of course, sex and relationship education. To merely ask for equality with existing sex and relationship education would, of course, be a good thing, but surely not a sufficient thing. We know from young people, gay and straight, that their view is that for the most part, sex and relationship education is very poor. It starts too late, it's too vague, it doesn't discuss relationships, it doesn't deal much with emotions and feelings. And astonishingly, it mostly doesn't even discuss child sexual abuse. Here we are as a society rightly concerned about the sexual abuse of young people, yet most schools completely ignore that issue. That is a form of child sexual abuse. When you look at the standards of sex and relationship education in our schools, there are some schools that are doing really good stuff, but they are a very distinct minority. Most young people say, first of all, it's not LGBT inclusive, and second, that even for straight kids, it's woefully inadequate. They learn about the biology of reproduction, about guinea pigs and rabbits, but not about teenage people and human beings. The problem is that with the equal rights mantra, it doesn't address many of these valid, legitimate issues. It helps nice, respectable gays who are prepared to compromise and conform to the status quo. But those who rock the boat, who ask awkward questions, well, they get left behind. I don't want LGBT people to turn themselves into facsimiles of straight morality. I don't want us to be marginalized when we ask these awkward, difficult questions. And I think by asking these questions and posing these legitimate alternatives, we're not only doing our favor to our own community, we're also helping straight people. We're building an alliance between LGBT and straight people to question the status quo, to suggest a transformative social agenda that could benefit everyone, whatever our sexual orientation and whatever our gender identity. That creates a unity, a solidarity, a strength which empowers us all. I think also, not wishing to be too harsh and cruel, I think the demand for equality by LGBT people is often tinged with a whiff of self-obsession bordering on selfishness. We're concerned about our rights, our freedoms, our equality, but we offer nothing to our straight friends and allies. Perhaps if we supported the sexual human rights of straights, more of them might be inclined to support us in return. In contrast to this shallow equal rights reformism, queer LGBT groups like Outrage had a post-equality agenda to seek the extension of sexual freedom and human rights in ways that benefit everyone, regardless of sexuality or gender identity. We sought to reframe the queer rights agenda to make it an agenda for universal human rights and universal sexual emancipation. But sadly, the majority in the LGBT movement never saw things that way. So when it comes to the push for same-sex partnership rights, initially for civil partnerships and later for civil marriage, that was pretty typical of the short-sightedness, the limited horizons of the LGBT movement. When it came to civil partnerships, the majority of LGBT organizations and campaigners looked to the Danish model of registered partnerships as the gold standard. They didn't think about a new framework. Because after all, civil partnerships are essentially marriage by another name. It's the marriage model with a different name and a few other basic minor details changed. Why not think beyond what is to what could be? In those outrage days in the early 1990s, we proposed what we've now renamed a civil commitment pact, a whole new framework, different from both civil partnerships and civil marriages. We shared the feminist critique. The feminist critique of marriage saw it as historically a patriarchal institution. Neither marriage nor its sibling civil partnerships was ever originally about love. It was about property and male power. Marriage was devised as a system for the male sexual control of women and to ensure the inheritance of property through the male line from father to son, to guarantee paternity so that the father could know that this child was his legitimate son and that he would inherit male property. You can see residues of it in today's marriage institutions. Just take the terms husband and wife. An alternative meaning for the word husband is to manage and control. And that sort of symbolizes the way in which historically many men, not all men, many men treated their wives. Or you see it today in the survival of that male control of women, where the father of the bride gives away his daughter to the husband-to-be, symbolizing the passing of women from one man to another. So for all these reasons, I think we should be critical of the institution of marriage and its offspring, civil partnerships. If we were starting from scratch, I don't think we'd adopt the marriage model. And important though it was to challenge the homophobic, biphobic and transphobic nature of the ban on same-sex marriage, that itself was not sufficient. I proposed the idea of a civil commitment pact, a whole new framework to get away from the marriage and civil partnership model. Under this system, anybody could nominate any significant other as their next of kin and beneficiary. So it could be a partner, a sexual romantic partner, or it could be a lifelong best friend, a favourite niece or nephew, whatever. Why should those in romantic love-type relationships have the exclusive privilege of next of kin and inheritance tax breaks? That's discrimination against single people, which is also wrong. When it comes to people in a loving relationship, under my proposed civil commitment pact, a couple would be able to create their own tailor-made partnership agreement from a menu of rights and responsibilities. So the idea is that in modern societies, there's a huge variety of different relationships, lifestyles, and experiences. The one-size-fits-all model of marriage and civil partnerships is no longer appropriate. We need a new framework, a new template to recognize love and commitment between two people, or perhaps ultimately between 3 or 4 or 5 people, whatever floats your boat. Under this system, as I said, a couple will be able to pick and choose from a menu of rights and responsibilities. This recognizes that nowadays some couples share their finances, others maintain financial independence. Some live together, others live apart. Some have children, others don't. The law should recognize those differences and accommodate them. The other advantage, of course, is that if couples had to go through the list of menus or the menu of rights and responsibilities, they would have to sit down and negotiate and jointly sign each particular right and responsibility. And I think it might make couples a little bit more cautious and careful about what they were getting into. They'd have to think more carefully about the obligations and responsibilities they were taking on, whereas with marriage and civil partnerships, it is a one-size-fits-all. You just sign the dotted line. There's no negotiation, no thought. So what I'm trying to say is, what I'm proposing, this civil commitment pact, may not be the best idea. I'm sure there are greater minds than mine who will be able to come up with something much, much better. But it's my attempt to move beyond what is to what could be, to move beyond what we've been saddled with for centuries and think about new ways of evolving partnership, recognition and rights for everyone, LGBT and heterosexual. So, to me, thinking for ourselves, not just accepting what is, but thinking for ourselves and looking beyond the narrow confines of law reform, to me, that's a good thing for LGBT people and for straight people. I think it means that we can help chart a course towards transforming society in ways that will be beneficial for everyone. Having this kind of inclusive queer agenda is not only right and just, it also makes good political and strategic sense. If we just focus on LGBT issues, we narrow the field. We narrow our constituency of support. And of course, we create sitting targets for homophobes. But if we frame things in terms of comprehensive legislation, like the Equality Act 2010, which brought together all the different equality laws into a new framework, which created a sense of unity and solidarity between women, black and ethnic minority people, LGBTs, disabled people, the elderly, people of different faiths and beliefs. That approach, that comprehensive equality approach, seems to me much better. Although, of course, I would like to take it further and beyond the limits of equal rights. I'll just finish with a quote from Oscar Wilde. He once wrote, "We are all in the gutter. Some of us are looking at the stars." I think the LGBT movement needs to rediscover the vision thing. That means daring to imagine what society could be rather than accepting society as it is. Thank you.